Hello, my name is Ian Watson, and I am currently a Director Emeritus of the American Membrane Technology Association, or AMTA. The interview you are about to see is the 34th in a series of what we call Chats with the Pioneers. AMTA is a technical association founded on the advocacy of membrane technology for water treatment, from wastewater reclamation and reuse to seawater desalination. The heart of this technology is the membrane itself. About 3.5 years ago, our board of directors decided that to preserve the history of membrane and membrane system development, the association should make an effort to record these chats with those responsible for launching what is now a technology in common use throughout the world. AMTA's intent is to make segments of these chats available on its website, so that a new generation of engineers and scientists can understand the efforts of these pioneers to help solve some of the water issues facing the world today. With me for this session, I have on my immediate left Mr. Ashwin Desai. In the center, Mr. Charles, fondly known as Chip Harris, and Mr. Jerry Alexander. And Jerry, I'll start with you. If you could give us sort of a brief recap of your education and career.
I graduated from Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1964. And right out of school, I went to work for the Permuted Company, which at the time was one of the major water treatment organizations. While there, I was an application engineer. In the evening, I got my MBA to prove that I wasn't an engineer, so I could go out and make some real money. Shortly after that, I entered sales, covered the New York City area up until 1975, and then I moved to Los Angeles area in California, where I was a regional sales manager, and conducted my work there through 1982, at which time I was approached by a British water treatment company called Portals Water Treatment to join them because they were acquiring a water treatment organization called LA Water Treatment, and they wanted me to act as their VP of Marketing and Sales. I did join them, and I did serve in that position through about 1990, at which time I became president of the company. It was then acquired by Thames Water, who after a few years recognized we were an industrial company and they were a municipal organization, so they shut down the business, at which time I left and I became a salesperson for Glegg Water Conditioning out of Guelph, Canada. And I worked there for about 8 years, rose to the position of VP of Sales. At that time, the company was acquired by General Electric. I stayed there for approximately 1 year before leaving to join what was then U.S. Filter, which was owned by Veolia, subsequently owned by Siemens Water, and most recently, within the last 6 months, was bought by a private equity company called AEA and has now been renamed Evoqua Water Technologies. And in that position there, I have two titles, one being Business Development Manager for Oil and Gas, and my second, Global Director, Process Water.
Good. Thank you, Jerry. Chip, what about you?
Well,
Don't
my educational background is not as vaulted as some. I started in a small water and wastewater treatment company about a year after I got out of high school, as a way to work my way through school, through a local junior college. I liked what I did. Company soon went out of business, and I dabbled around in construction until I started back in water in 1979, when I went to work for Mostec Corporation out in Texas as a DI water maintenance technician. Ended up moving back to Florida at some point, and ended up being lucky enough to be asked to go to work with Basic Technologies, which was a pioneer firm, OEM in the Florida market. Went from Basic Tech to HydroPro, which was kind of a continuation of Basic Tech, since many of the people that were there have ended there. Stayed with them for a number of years. My role has always been, I'm a field hand at best. I do commissioning startups and things like that. left Basic Tech, ended up with Energy Recovery Inc. for a short stint as their technical manager. Left them and was with Advanced Membrane Systems for several years as their manager of technical and manager of manufacturing. And had my own firm for a short time, and then my most recent posting before now was with Aqualink Holding AS as their chief technical officer based in Dubai, and I've just recently repatriated back to the U.S.
Thank you. Ashwin?
First of all, I'm honored to be included in the Pioneers group, and thank you very much for that. I graduated from University of Michigan in 1960 in chemical engineering, and did my master's in chemical engineering from Wayne State University in 1965. During that time, I had a couple of jobs in Cleveland, and I think in 1965, I got transferred to California by buyers of my old company, Ryan Industries. It was in the cryogenic business. And the company in California, the name was Cosmodyne Corporation. And Mr. Bartlett was James Bartlett. He's the owner of Hydronautics, ex-owner of Hydronautics. He was president of Cosmodyne Corporation. And I worked at Cosmodyne till 1974, and then Mr. Bartlett had kind of retired in 74, and he moved to Santa Barbara, and then he called me to join the water group business. And I think, like I mentioned in my biography, only thing I knew about water was the formula. And seriously, and all the other people were part of the Roga alumni or, a lot more experience. So that was the first beginning in water business, 1974. And I started as a product engineer and moved up through the ranks within the company. Eventually became vice president of systems business. And then in 1984, Mr. Bartlett sold the business to Roman Haas. That was, I think it lasted for about 3 years. And then they in turn sold it to Nito Danko. And then I became president of the company after Nito Danko acquired the company. And I stayed with them for a couple of years to start my own business. And that was in 1990. And Membrane Systems Corporation. I sold the business in 2006 to H2O Innovation of Canada, and I did some consulting with them for 3 to 4 years, and then I'm kind of now semi-retired.
Good. One day, hopefully, I'll be semi-retired. Chip, you...
Yes, sir.
At Mostech, did you get involved in RO at all?
Yes, Mostech was a facility that treated city water and then made it into deionized water for the fabrication areas for semiconductor manufacture. So they did have reverse osmosis systems. The old systems and the new systems. They had some of the old Dow 20K. Brackish water hollow fiber membranes in racks, which was a product I was actually familiar with based on my smaller systems work in Florida. And then they had just built a brand new facility where they had these newfangled things called spiral wound membranes, and that was kind of cool because they were big and long, and the cartridges were very strange and different. That it went from a bunch of fibers bundled together to actually sheets that had been rolled, and that was kind of entertaining. But we had a full range of treatment. We had filtration treatment, we had the membrane treatment, we had ultraviolet, we had, and then of course the polishing was the DI beds, both dual bed and single bed systems.
So it was, when you went to Basic Technologies, it wasn't a real surprise when you were working with almost exclusively with membranes.
No, it was kind of surprising the way I got to Basic Technologies, because I'd relocated back from Texas with my new bride at the time, and you can appreciate why I say that. Was looking for a job, and I saw an ad in the paper for an RO company looking for a draftsman, and that's what the ad read. Now, I knew what an RO company was because I'd been working in RO for a while. I mean, I've done a couple of drawings, and some of my best things are stick figures. But I went and applied for the draftsman's job, and was, I interviewed with the head of engineering, and who then passed me on to the head of their service department, who at that time was Ben Mullenhoff, and interviewed with Ben. And the interview concluded, nothing special, didn't think about anything, drove back to the town where I was living in, which is about an hour's north, and by the time I got back to my home, they'd called the house 3 times looking for me. This wasn't a time, obviously, before cell phones, and they had apparently wanted to give me a job.
Nice.
I was thrilled, yeah.
But you thought you were going to be a draftsman.
Well, I you know what, it was the time in my life where I would have taken any job that came along.
I think we first met when you were at LA Water Treatment,
Correct.
and we worked together on a couple of projects, one of which being Plantation,
Yes.
which wasn't probably the greatest success in the world, at least not then. But you had some you had some pretty big projects at LA Water Treatment.
Yes.
You recall a couple of the others?
Well, we were very fortunate in that we recognized membranes were the technology of the future, if you will. So at that time, I hired a gentleman by the name of Harbons Coley, who is well known in the industry, in my opinion, one of the most knowledgeable membrane people there is. And we noticed that the state of Florida, because of the THM issues, trihalomethanes, were going to be going toward membranes to remove the precursors. If you remove the organic material, you don't have THMs. So we hired Harbons with the intent of trying to penetrate the market. And in those days, fortunately, AE firms, engineering firms, were nervous about membranes. They weren't sure if they worked. So at that time, the specs were written as black boxes. There was a drawing, and in the middle was a box, and it said RO, water in, water out. So in those days, it was left up to the equipment supplier to really design the system, and which gave us a lot of flexibility. It also let us evaluate operating costs versus capital costs because of flux rate, membrane area. So we went after the market quite hard, and in those days, we also installed systems as well, which is a little bit unusual. And with Harbon's direction and hard work, we were quite successful in Florida for a period of about 5 years. We did very, very well until the point when the engineering firms felt they knew enough about it that they would take over the design of the system, make it more of a commodity purchase so a GC, a general contractor, could buy the parts. So a system supplier or a designer, his influence diminished, and at that time several things happened, and we kind of not exited the market, but felt it wasn't a very good market for us. But during that period of time, we sold, I'm guessing, about a dozen systems of very nice capacity, Plantation being one of them. If we can forget about the lawsuit, which you alluded to, it was a good job.
Yeah, and another one I worked on that you built was Palm Coast, the original Palm Coast plant.
Yes.
Which I still have a picture of. It's a nice-looking facility. Ashwin, I first met you on Sanibel Island,
Exactly.
which is a strange place for somebody to meet. When you Hydronautics Water Systems, as it was called then,
Right.
bid our project down there, and against everybody's advice, I selected you to build the plant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still there, so it's still running. But that was really, I think, Hydronautics' first big project, municipal project in the U.S.
Yeah, domestic and also in Florida, and I think that was a big accomplishment for us because we were the new company, new kid on the block, and I remember the presentation we made to you and the board. And one main question was, what happens to hydronautics water system if Mr. Bartlett, he used to fly planes all the time, single. If he runs into mountains or something like that, and that was the big consideration at that time.
I remember that.
But I think it was very nice of you and the Sanibel Island board to give us the project. It turned out to be a really good project for us.
Yeah, I remember that question.
Yeah.
One of the directors at the time was a retired insurance company executive.
Right, yeah.
And he was the one that asked the question.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to make sure that he had all bases covered if the guy who was...
Yeah.
And you had to bond that project.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yeah.
Jim's money was on the line.
Mm-hmm.
And if he should fly into a mountain,
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of odd. But
And we had big competition on that project. I think, if I remember correctly, Permuted
Permuted,
was in the running.
Were
yeah.
you still there then, Jerry? This would have been...
No,
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 No, you were
after
gone
I
by
left,
then?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was Permuted Envirogenics
Exactly.
and Polymetrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Then subsequently to that, and actually at that time, the notoriety that hydronautics had was solely to do with humor.
That is very true. I think what we did is we bid the Yuma project only 20% of the total capacity, about 21 million gallons per day. And I think the reason we came out low bidder on overall, considering the capital cost and the operating cost, was the optimization we had done for the design. Okay, what recovery, what power requirements, membranes, and everything. So, I think that was a huge accomplishment, and also that put us on the market, in the industry.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Chip, you and I first met shortly after you went to work for Basic Technologies, I think.
That's correct.
You were working on a project that I was involved in Florida. And in the years that you spent there, you worked on a number of projects. Is there one that stands out, that either as the most fun or the most pain in the butt, or?
City of Venice. Yeah, we had gotten tagged to go in and do an upgrade, well, both an upgrade and an extension to the City of Venice's original hollow fiber membrane plant, and we ended up with Dow, our Dow hollow fiber product that we were pretty well engaged with at that point, and there were 2 trains of the DuPont product there next to us, and the Dow hollow fiber was was often challenged with feedwater problems, and we had a number of problematic issues with both the membrane, system design, things like that. But it did work itself out. But I did spend a lot of time in Venice, which, on a positive note, allowed me to get to know Jim Harn, John Bonacici, and some of those guys.
Right.
As well as increasing my troubleshooting education, since I did have to troubleshoot a lot of different things at that particular facility. So.
When you all started, not necessarily right at the beginning, but as your careers and the membranes progressed, did any of you think that one day you may be sitting at the edge of the ocean doing it? Or was seawater so far in advance that it hadn't really reached your horizon yet?
No, I did think about it. I think possibilities were there, definitely. But at that time, hydronautics water systems, we didn't have the membrane. And Mr. Bartlett, the owner, I think he wanted to get into the membrane business, and he eventually did that. And but we didn't have the right membrane for seawater applications.
Right.
For me, I knew there was seawater stuff out there because at the same time that the B9s were out there and the B10s were out there, and that I knew that there were seawater projects out there, and I was quite excited by the opportunity. I didn't quite understand what the challenges would be until I got on my first seawater project. But I knew that at that time, we're talking early 80s, there were projects out there, and there were not big ones, but there were a lot of resorts and hotels and places like that down in the Caribbean, and I was anxious to go to the beach. Not a complete idiot, Somebody sent me on a seawater project, I can go to the beach and hang out.
Well, there was, I guess, the thing that started, shall we say, the big seawater plant drive was the original Jetta project, which Fluid Systems won.
Right.
When they were still in the systems business.
As well as the Malta plants that would go back.
And the
quite a
Malta
ways.
plants, and then Polymetrics built a seawater plant in Yambu, I think it was, shortly after the Jetta plant went in, and then the Malta plants came just after that. But it seems to me that most of those early plants were, 3 or 4 or maybe 5 million gallons a day, and all of a sudden, in a relatively short period of time, we went from 5 MGD to 100 MGD. And Jerry, why do you think that happened?
Well, first, actually, the first major desalting plant in the Western Hemisphere was Gaddafi, down in Venezuela. I don't know if you recall it.
That's right. That's
But
right.
early on, Bermuda decided DuPont were the horse to ride in the race. There was the hollow fine fiber people, the Dow and the DuPont, and then the spiral people, the Fluid Systems. And Bermuda pursued what that time was considered a very large desalting plant in Venezuela. I believe it was about 3 MGD, and using the DuPont hollow fine fibers, which was installed, and it was claimed as a success. Many articles were written about it, and that was my first exposure to the seawater market. But the economics changed rather rapidly because of the difficulties the fine fibers had with fouling, and naturally later on the advent of the polyamide membranes made it more attractive with reduced operating costs. So it really became a question of economics. I mean, the need is there for fresh water, and it became cost competitive. At that time, they were still looking at freezing technologies along with the conventional thermal technologies, but the membranes quickly gained acceptance and basically dominated the market, which they still do today.
I should probably make a disclosure here. At one time, I worked for Ashwin. I think the only one of the people we've interviewed so far that I actually worked for.
So you have
Directly.
conflict of interest then, huh?
So I'm declaring a potential conflict of interest.
Right.
But I recall when I was at Hydronautics Water Systems that we bid on a couple of seawater plants with two-pass approach because we didn't have a membrane.
We didn't have it, yeah.
So we had to have 2 lots of membranes to get to potable water standards.
Yeah. Two-stage kind of,
Yeah. And, sometimes I think that in those days was not that bad of an approach.
Yeah, actually two-stage gives a lot of flexibility at that time actually, based on the membrane characteristics, but also reduces, it did reduce commercial risk from the warranties point of view and performance and everything.
Right.
So I think you are absolutely right, yeah.
And I think, if I remember correctly, I think Envirogenics actually won a project with that approach because they also didn't have a seawater membrane. But they, as I recall, Sojex, which at that time had bought Envirogenics, won a project with a two-pass system, two-stage system. So as the years have gone by, and Jerry made a good point just now about the way that engineers viewed RO changed as they thought, and I won't include myself in that group, but as they thought they understood how the process worked, that they could design the plant themselves. And as a result of that, I noticed with some of the more illustrious names in the business that the plants became probably a lot more expensive to build than they had been when the OEMs were doing the engineering work. Do you think that's a true statement?
Yes and no. I mean, if an engineering company, which has a lot of reputation as well as a lot of overhead, including errors and omissions and everything else, is cited with designing the plant, for a large scale plant, and the system, there is no more system supplier. There is a pretty significant cash outlay in regards to that design. That full plant design. In the old days, there was a lot of bits and pieces design. Somebody would take a bit and piece of this, and an EPC guy would take this, and system supplier would take this, and a lot of times it was very difficult to coordinate that. There were literally times when a pipe was here and a pipe was here, which also cost money. But I think that because of the limb that the engineers have to go out on, they're tasked with designing a plant that will meet a specific criteria for X amount of time, then yeah, there probably is some additional overhead in that. But I also think it's a safeguard for the end user. That the end user has a certain amount of safety in that should anything bad happen, they can go back to the engineer rather than trying to claim it through 6 different entities to try and find out who did what and how.
But you'd think, and you can, both Jerry and Ashwin feel free to comment, but you would think that if that was the case, that the OEM business would have died. Because now you've got a situation where the engineers are designing the systems and a general contractor could build it.
My personal opinion, not exactly the case.
I'm just throwing it out there.
From my point of view, I think nothing wrong in having A&E design buildings and all these infrastructures and everything, but I think they got into a little bit too much when they started defining the RO system design. Okay, and I'm not talking about you were specialist, you had a lot of experience, but a lot of other A&Es, big companies, they didn't know much about it, okay, at least when I was in the system business. And I think I also thought that they sort of ruined OEM market. We became sophisticated plumbers.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to say that, but it's
Yeah.
No, I would agree.
Yeah.
That there was a time when this first movement started that many people thought they could design a plant with all of its aspects and with no specialized knowledge or training. And that's the kind of thing that ends up with making work, for more specialty engineering, like specialty engineers like yourself, who would end up getting calls at the last minute from some larger engineering company going, "Help me," to try and assure that they had a valid design.
But I'm thinking more about the cost of the plant itself, because I've noticed, and after I left Hydronautics and started Rostec Services, one of my first projects was the Cape Coral expansion, which Hydronautics built. And the original plant had been built in the late 70s by Permuted, and all the piping was 316L stainless steel. So we used 316L stainless steel.
Mm-hmm.
We actually took apart some of the original piping and looked at it, and it was like brand new. So we said, well, there was no problem with this, we could use that. But a lot of the more recent plants, and Schedule 10, a lot of the more recent plants I've noticed have gone to Schedule 40 pipe, and some have even gone to duplex stainless steel for brackish water, which I think is,
Overkill?
overkill. A good example, which is coming out to bid soon, will be the San Antonio project. And I've always felt that when engineers that work for big A&Es got involved, they were looking at something that they felt was safe rather than what was appropriate.
conservative.
Yeah, very conservative.
I
Yeah.
think they also tried to create a commodity environment where it was like buying replacement tires on a car. And as such, they were very narrowly focused in their knowledge of the technology. They understood membranes as it applied to the municipal market, but there are many advancements being made in the industrial side of the business, many different applications that proved to develop knowledge and information that could be applied in the municipal market, but it never was, because it was in the benefit of the engineering firms to create a commodity environment, as they've tried for a long time to do now in the ultrafiltration market, to be quite honest. They are finally starting to crack that shell that they've been kept out of, where each membrane manufacturer still maintains a unique product, but they're trying to drive it the way of the membranes, if the RO membranes, where it's 8-inch diameter by 40-inch long, and everybody provided the same product, and who can do it the cheapest.
Yeah, I've noticed, in fact, I got a call not too long ago. It was a utility in the Midwest somewhere, I forget where it was, but they were thinking about buying a membrane filtration plant. And their first question was, can we get membrane replacements from people other than the original ones? And I said, well, there are now companies on the market that claim to make replacement modules, but the difficulty is that you may not get the same performance out of the plant. They'll
Exactly.
certainly fit the piping, but they may not give you the same performance. And
Well, even the ramifications of the, as you said, the 8-inch by 40 RO membrane cartridges. I've recently done a lot of business in one of our far eastern lands, and I had come across a company, our EPC company had a membrane group, and they were building their own seawater RO membranes. And I'd asked them, I said, well, surely you've got to have some software that defines the design, and I was told that I should probably use Dow's software, because that would come pretty close to what it was they were doing. And that again, we're in that point where I think the UFs are going that way as well. But I would agree with your point. The plants are more expensive now. Again, it's what I said earlier with the engineering services, the larger engineering firms trying to protect themselves, because especially in America, we're a very litigious country and people sue over everything. But I also know that as a system supplier on large scale systems, that price of materials has gone up dramatically from the time that we first started.
Yeah.
And the price of fabrication now is significantly different. Where it was okay in the 70s to put in a carbon steel skid with a little bit of epoxy paint on it and a 3/16 stainless piping system that corroded away in a while. It's now more exotic materials for the framework, more things that it was less maintenance on the downside and more capex on the front side.
on the front side. Yeah.
And that I view that as a good thing, because having had to bend and scrape and paint and do some other things on a few units myself, that I like that concept, but it does increase the capex on the project.
You think that one of the successes of membranes have enjoyed over the past few years, the past 20 years, say, was due to the passage of the Safe Drinking Water Act? Did it have a significant effect?
I think it's made more people aware. I think the Safe Drinking Water Act required people to act. It required certain municipalities, even small municipalities, to get up off their tails and do something. Most of the systems that are affected by the Safe Drinking Water Act, or were affected when the Safe Drinking Water Act came out, were systems that needed attention anyway.
Yeah.
And this forced these things into the forefront, and some of the systems were in such random non-compliance that they had to go to membrane systems. But I think membranes are not the perfect Band-Aid for everything, in many cases. Depends on how in depth you want to do the design, but they do cure a lot of ills for the common person, so to speak. And for the common water treatment system, they will do a lot for the Safe Drinking Water Act compliance.
Yeah, I've always thought it was an elegant unit process,
It is an elegant unit process. It's
more so than most conventional
It's more
water
elegant than
treatment
some of
unit
its,
processes.
It's more elegant than some of its practitioners, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
It wasn't exactly aimed at you.
How was it competing against one another in the early days? I mean, I was sort of involved a little bit, although my work at Hydronautics was mainly outside the U.S. But I was involved from the other side on lots of times where Hydronautics Water Systems, Basic Technologies, and LA Water Treatment were competing against one another.
It's odd that you'd say that, because HydroPro, when HydroPro first started out, we weren't a systems integrator for a long time. We were a service company. As a matter of fact, that was the mandate, because the guys that formed HydroPro didn't want to be a full-scale OEM at the time. So we were doing work for other people. We did installations for LA Water.
Yes.
Let's see, Boynton Beach would have been a good example of
Plantation.
that. Plantation's another one. We were doing installations for Hydronautics at that time. Jupiter is the big one that I can think of right now. So we were not competing at that point. And when we did compete and start doing systems, we were doing small systems, but we were buying from the Hydronautics and and some of the other membrane manufacturers. So the sense of competition in the industry is kind of odd for me. I was talking to someone about my relationship with Jimmy Harn. I was talking to my wife about my relationship with Jimmy Harn, because we ran into him this morning. And Jimmy and I, at the time I was at Basic and he was Harn RO. We were direct competitors. And yet when Jimmy and I got together, we never talked shop. We talked cars, but we wouldn't talk shop.
Yeah, right.
But it was a fraternity in those days. It really was more of a fraternity
Yeah.
base, at least to me.
I viewed
Well,
it had some major changes. The first wave of RO was in the early to mid-'70s, when it was truly driven by the OEMs, the system suppliers. And then as that market tended to get saturated and the needs were satisfied, it kind of disappeared to about the mid-'80s, about 85,
Right.
and the THM issue came up. And the initial people that jumped into the market were relatively smaller companies. And there was only a handful, really, maybe 5 or 6. And you knew each other, and it was a friendly competition, to be quite honest. But once again, as the engineering firms took over the marketplace, if you will, they changed it into a commodity business, which attracted more people. The scope of the system got smaller and smaller, to all of a sudden it was just racks with membranes. So the picture of the industry has changed on the municipal side dramatically, from a system supplier to more of a commodity supplier. There are some tweaks people can do, but in general, the AE controls the marketplace and sets the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are these, I'll call it the equipment suppliers, sharing a very small part of the margin.
What did you think? I mean, you competed.
No, I think first of all we respected all the companies as such. At the same time, we were locking horns also, like Cape Coral project. We had Envirogenics protested against the award of contract to Hydronautics. Even I remember I had a lot of respect for LA Water, but I remember our locking on at the city of LA. Yeah. So, but with that doesn't diminish respect for individuals and the companies. Okay,
Right.
it's part of business.
Yeah.
You know.
As a consultant, one of the things that concerns me about the commodity approach that you described, Jerry, is that there's no single entity left to take responsibility for the performance of the facility when it's built. I mean, if you supply the racks and the vessels and the membranes and the rack piping, but not the controls, somebody else supplies the pump, there's really nobody that the owner can point to and say, well, why doesn't your stuff work? Because you say, well, my stuff works fine, but his stuff doesn't work. And I've noticed, personally, I've noticed a trend back in the other direction a little bit. That you see, even some of the bigger engineering firms now, you see the scope of the OEM, the previously specialist OEM, expanding a little bit. Have you seen that at all in your journeys around the business lately?
Where that's influence is more on the wastewater side of the business, I believe, because now the feed water is more poorly defined, and therefore the pretreatment, many times membrane pretreatment ahead of an RO, is more critical. And when you get into that part of the business, I do think that they're looking for the OEMs to assume more liability in the design of the plant. I would agree with you.
Right.
Well, I can give you an example. Orange County Water District, this big project and everything, and they bought everything separately, okay, pumps and membranes, and they bought racks from us with pressure vessels and everything. But finally, during the startup time, they called us to do the whole thing. Okay, we had to start up the pumps, we had to look at the PLC and everything. So Paul Laverty was there for many, many months as such. And because at that time, Orange County Water District themselves have a lot of experience, but the overall A&E didn't provide the individual responsibilities and everything. So,
Yeah, I've noticed some of the specs going out that the A&E will actually hold part of the scope back for themselves, such as the programming of the PLC. Many companies now have that capability, and well, they have the programming capability in-house. Whether they have the ability to write the correct logic is another matter.
Right.
That's a frightening thought.
But I've noticed that on a couple of projects recently, where that's been part of the A&E's responsibility. And certainly when that happens, then the A&E is responsible for the operation of that plant. And I don't think my E&O insurance carrier would allow me to do that.
Well, I know, I've spent the last number of years in the build, own, operate transfer market overseas, and we own the plant. So we had to have some, design basis of our own, that we retain some intellectual property into that, and that we were going to own the plant, we were going to be owning the water. We were going to be selling the water. We didn't have any recourse in terms of that.
Right.
So, it was very important for us to work very closely with the EPC contractors to, number one, identify an EPC contractor that knew what to do, and then number two, to really define design. We would participate in design review meetings and, overall commissioning, supervision, and things like that to try and safeguard that little part of that. But that's, again, that's in a place where they don't actually have A&E firms to design plants.
Design plants, right. But and that raises another interesting point, because I've noticed recently again that some of the boot projects, the recipient of the water are now hiring owner's engineers to make sure the plant is built correctly. And that raises another issue, because now, if they say we don't want it to be built that way, because at some point the owner may want to transfer ownership to themselves, how much problem does that cause?
This does cause some issues, especially if the chosen owner's engineer doesn't have a water background, which I've seen more than once. And that can create a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. That's you see all these models being thrown out there. Well, this is the best way to go. You want to go boot, or you want to go PPP, or you want to do this, or you want to do that. But at the end of the day, somebody is responsible for, or has to take the responsibility for performing.
Where I was, we took that responsibility very seriously, because it was to boil down to it, it was our investors' money in the plant, and therefore we had to take it very seriously. They expected a return on that money as well.
I think in the old days, OEMs were doing all these things because they are always in the bottom of the totem pole. Okay, so if something goes wrong, then the blame will come to the OEM.
Right.
So you want to take care of the problems, So, but now I don't know, with the big mega plants, it's very, very confusing.
The OEMs always used to blame the membrane manufacturers because we couldn't do that because we
We
made our
couldn't
own
do that.
membranes.
No.
You have, all of you have had long and distinguished careers in this industry. What do you think, if you had to choose some event or some innovation or some application that you consider your greatest achievement, what would it be? Jerry?
Wow. I wouldn't put this in
Apart from hiring hub-ons.
I would put this one in the achievement category, but an event that happened that I think changed the history of not only membranes, but the water treatment industry. And at the time I was on the periphery, so I hope I get most of the facts right, and they are true, was when I was with Permuted. As you may be aware, they were one of the pioneers in the water industry, and their initial choice was to go with the DuPont membranes. They bet on that horse in the race, and after a few years began to realize maybe it wasn't the best choice. So the management at the time of Permuted, which was perhaps the leading water treatment organization, OEM in the United States, decided to take action to retain a strong position in that market. And I don't believe it's well known, but they made an offer to buy what at the time was Fluid Systems from Gulf Atomics. And they made an offer, a certain sum of money, which by modern standards is rather meager, I think several $1 million. And it was turned down. So the president of Permuted went back to the corporate parent, who at the time was Ritter. They were big in the dental business. And I think they needed $5 million to acquire Fluid Systems. And they were turned down. Ritter felt they could make a better return on dental chairs than they could on water treatment equipment. So they said no. And Permuted was not successful in buying Fluid Systems. They did create a skunk works in their R&D center in Princeton to develop their own membrane, but the company then was sold to Zurn. They found out about the skunk works. They hired a Mr. Tidball, I believe his name was.
Bob
Robert,
Tidball,
yeah.
from
that's right.
Envirogenics.
He was
Yeah.
going to help Permuted because they couldn't buy a spiral wound company. They were going to make their own. And the new owners found out about it, and, well, let's say they weren't happy about it, and there was change in management. But I often wonder if Permuted had bought Fluid Systems,
What would have
perhaps the greatest water treatment company at the time, or the greatest membrane company at the time, what would have happened to the market? Where would we be today?
That's right.
So I often think about that.
That's an interest. I never knew that.
Not many people did know it. Not many people are still alive to know it.
That's right. That's right. Chip, what about you?
I don't have any particular, events or shattering changes in mind. I've been very lucky in my career to have been either on the periphery or directly involved with a number of plants, mostly with a number of plant problems. That I've been very fortunate enough to be called upon to help people solve their problems over years, and that's the biggest single thing I can think of is shortly after City of Cape Coral had installed a large amount of Dow hollow fiber membranes in their plant. They were starting to have problems with membrane failures, and however it ended up, I ended up being part of the team to go and look into that, and we managed to find that it was not a membrane problem, but an operational problem, which ended up getting myself and the Dow rep thrown out under sheriff's guard. It's not the first time I've been thrown out by a sheriff, but it was the first time I've been thrown out professionally.
Ashwin, what about you?
Well,
I mean,
on a-
humor had to have been.
now on a personal level, okay, I wish I had started my own business
Earlier.
long time before. But at the same time, I had to give a lot of credit to hydronautics water systems also. A lot of pluses and minuses working for a private owner. You learn a lot. At the same time, hydronautics water systems did not grow as much as it could have, okay, because we were limited to use our own membranes, okay, and that was a big negative for us, you know. 8.5-inch membrane element, that was a special size membrane for us. You remember that, I think. But he made a lot of money. You know, we were selling CA membranes in Saudi Arabia for $2,400.
Yeah, I remember that.
Can you remember that? Can you believe that? You know,
Yeah.
so,
Man,
so he made out from, you know, great.
And we used to sell them twice sometimes.
I know, I know. So, yeah, you were there.
I
yeah.
was there.
Yeah,
I remember,
so-
remember being at Jim Finley's house one time. He
Yeah.
probably had 50 elements in the backyard and gluing the end caps back on.
I worked for a guy once that sold the same sewage treatment plant 3 times.
Yeah. That was, yeah, you know, systems, we were not making that kind of money, but on the membrane
The membrane.
replacement, I think that was great for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
You have one person that you would describe as a mentor, Ashwin?
I have to say Mr. Bartlett, because not only I learned so much from him, but also he was very fair, gave me all the opportunities, and, you know, I kept rising in the organization and everything, and he was very open and fair.
Chip?
Well, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to work with a number of great people in the industry. The person that I would point to as the greatest mentor for me would, oddly enough, be our interviewer today.
That's foolish.
Good point, but I'm a crazy guy anyway. So.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Jerry, what about you?
Well, this may sound odd, but you normally think of a mentor being somebody above you and maybe your boss, if you will. But his name has been mentioned several times today, and I'll mention it one more time. Harbon Scully.
Yeah.
I actually hired him 3 times, believe it or not, which says how much I basically appreciated him and was in great awe of his knowledge. I hired him at LA Water when we got into the RO market. He left to go work for Stone & Webster for a few years and was unhappy, so I hired him back. And then when I went to U.S. Filter, they decided they wanted to get into the membrane market for RO, and I hired him a 3rd time. So hiring a person 3 times must say a lot about him.
That's right.
No,
That's right.
No, I second that. Jerry Harbans, you know, he came to work for us twice actually, and he's still working. You know,
That's right.
And he and I think another guy I give a lot of credit for our success is Paul Laverty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
agree.
tremendous guy. Yeah.
I agree. And we've interviewed Paul.
Mm-hmm.
We interviewed him in San Diego. a couple
I
years
think I worked with Harbines working for both of you guys.
Yeah.
So, the final question, and think about it carefully, is if you could roll the clock back, knowing what you now know about what you've been doing for the last 25 or 30 years, would you do it again?
Personally, I have no regrets. I wouldn't change a thing. If somebody would have told me I would have accomplished what I have in my business career, I would have been happy when I started. I would have said it's a good career. So I have no regrets, and I'm very proud, and I truly am passionate about the water industry and membranes in particular. I think it's a wonderful business.
Ashwin?
No, I have no regrets whatsoever. Sometimes I feel like getting into it again, you know, even though, you know, and you know, then I say, why? You know, it's crazy, you know. But I think I have no regrets actually.
I don't think I would do anything different than what I did. I only hope I can give as much back to the industry as the industry has given to me.
Actually, I have one last
Nice.
question for you, Chip.
Uh-oh.
If that ad in the newspaper had said, field service engineer. Would you have applied for it?
Oh, in a heartbeat, because I knew I was more qualified for that.
Very good, yeah.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate you all coming, and I appreciate your kind comment, Chip. And I'm sure we'll see each other around for a lot more years, hopefully anyway. Thanks very much.
Well,
Thanks
thank
again.
you.